At the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainian land was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, mostly Galicia, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina, and the Russian Empire, with the Ninth Right Banks and the Left Bank provinces. Therefore, at the beginning of the First World War, Ukrainians were forced to fight on different sides on the Eastern Front. The 1917 February Revolution is one of the consequences of the military conflict that led to the unleashing in the Ukraine. It led to the unleashing in Ukraine of the process of nationhood and the conclusion of the formation of the Ukrainian nation. But let's take a step back and let's see 1914 to 1917. Geopolitical position of the Ukrainian lands is considerable natural and human resources, and serve as one of the reasons for the shape of the struggle for the German, Austro-Hungarian and the Russian empires fighting in Galicia to Bukovina, or Ukraine. One of the important theatres in the military operations of the Eastern Front is the territory of Ukraine, primarily Eastern Galicia and Transcarpathia and Northern Bukovina, and the western part of Volhynia, which is the zone of operation on the Southwest Front, on which Russian troops fought against the Austro-Hungarians. In August and September 1914, Russian troops conducted a successful Galician operation occupying Galicia and Bukovina and the cities of Lviv and Chernovsky. A corps of Ukrainian sheath riflemen in the Austrian 130th Brigade, which fought against the Russian army in the Carpathian passes, had already been created at the start of the war. In January 1915, a new phase of armed confrontation between the Austro-Germans and the Russian troops began. In the course of the Carpathian operations, Russian troops under the command of General Alexei Brusilov took Przemysl, one of the best fortresses in Europe, on the 22nd of May 1915. In April 1915, Austro-German troops forced Russian armies out of the territory of Poland, Galicia and Lithuania in the course of the General Strategic Offensive, which is the Garnov-Kolev Offensive, and on the 22nd of June 1915, Austrian troops entered Lviv, and the front lines consolidated along the Kolmol-Vladimir-Vorsky-Bordy-Branchia. From May to August 1916, Russian forces made a new attempt at an offensive, known as the Brusilov Offensive, as a result of which Bukovina and part of eastern Galicia were taken. At the beginning of 1917, German and Austro-Hungarian troops again began an offensive of Lviv, Galich, Stanislav, Cherkanovsky, and the front line stabilized, and the majority of western Ukrainian lands again ended up under the Austro-Hungarian and German occupation. An offensive of Russian forces in the middle of July 1917, which took the cities of Galich and Kalush and were occupied, becoming the last military operation in Ukrainian lands. On the 19th of July 1917, the German commanders launched a counterattack at the Russian armies as they retreated to the rear, almost without resistance. The front stopped at the line of Brody, Zakaburo, Goramidilov, Zastir River. So, Ukrainian society after the First World War severed social, economic and spiritual ties, and basically destroyed and disintegrated social groups, and human and ethical and legal and common physiological norms and values change. It is said that the Ukrainian society changed in both quantity and quality. A considerable number of Ukrainians were torn from families, living environments. 4,500,000 Ukrainians fought on the Russian armies, and about 250,000 to 300,000 the Austro-Hungarian armies. New social groups appeared: displaced people, refugees, deportees. More than 600,000 Austro-Hungarian and German prisoners of war in Ukraine alone ended up in Ukraine territory, and at various times 420,000 to a million refugees or more passed through ethnical and social groups to Azerbaijan and the steppes. They were the victim of war. The Ukrainians, just like the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovenes and the Slovaks, but mostly the ones that shared the borders with Germany, Russia and Austro-Hungary, were the most war-torn people of all, because not only did they have to fight against their own people, their land was burned, scorched, destroyed, people displaced, people refugees in their own countries, people destroyed by occupation, and then emancipation, only to be dissolved by the USSR. But the Ukrainians had a brief independence, which I will touch on now. The revolution The revolutionary events in Russia, which basically the February Revolution brought the developments of uniform nations like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan and other countries under the Russian Empire and other ethnic groups. So the period from March 1917 to basically October 1920, when the Civil War ended and most countries under the USSR were assimilated to the socialist republics, they had a brief 2 years, 3 years if they were lucky, of peace, mostly in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan. Second, so the Ukrainian state was established in 1918 and lasted until the end of the Civil War, which is 1920-1921, where it was dissolved and absorbed by the USSR. The Ukrainian Central Rada, which is the UTSR, was created in Kiev, and urban social-political organizations were transformed into the leadership of Ukraine and liberated the nation. The well-known historian Mikhail Gorbachev was elected as its leader, and social-political figures such as Vladimir Voskano and Sergei Efmanov were their deputies. In June 1915, the first Ukrainian government was created, and the General Secretary of the UTSR published 4 legislationary acts, which are universal suffrage and other universal acts under the declaration of the newly independent Ukrainian state. And it joined the Democratic Russians before the October Revolution to be part of their country as well. So the People's Republic of Ukraine, or the Ukrainian People's Republic, the UNR, was on the 29th of April 1918, the creation of the Ukrainian state, or the Hetmanate, was proclaimed, with the monarch form being the hetman. He became Pavlov Skarpadsky, a former general of the Russian army. The power structure under his leadership managed to achieve relative internal stabilization, adopted the first budget in history of the country, normalized trade, and create some preconditional for some economic recovery. Considerable success was achieved in the era of development of the Ukrainian culture, education, and science, and attempts were made to create their own armed forces. A Minister of Public Health and Government Foster Care was created in the same time since the empire, and the humanitarian problems of the prisoners of war individuals, orphans, and refugees, inherent forms of the Russian Empire and the UNR were solved. At the same time, a reactionary policy was regarded to the peasants and the workers in the presence of the occupation of the troops, led to an anti-Hement revolt. The UNR once again proclaimed in the Ukraine of the middle of December 1918. It proclaimed by a colleague body, and the dictionary of Vladimir Voniska was its chairman. In November 1918, the West Ukrainian people of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, or the ZUNR, which was created in the western of Ukrainian lands, which is basically Galicia and Palestina and Bukovina. On the 22nd of January 1919, an act of unification between the ZUNR and the UNR into one state was held in Kiev. But in 1919 and 1920, the territory of Ukraine was once again thrown into war, and even a revolt, which was the red and white Russian Civil War and the Ukrainian revolt. So everyone can see the consequences of Ukraine even up to the modern day. But the First World War shaped Ukraine undeniably, and it caused refugees, social and humanitarian catastrophes in Ukraine. Like I said, people fighting each other. Then the Ukrainian people of the World War I had to be refugees in their own countries due to occupations from the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and even from the Russians again. Military. The losses among the civilian population, the mobilization of Eastern and Western Ukrainians, the economic disaster, the fundamental social changes that negatively influenced the living standards of Ukrainians, that led to the ruin of the patriarchal foundation of the Ukrainian society, the loss of morals, the loss of guideposts, and in search for escape from the autocratic Tsars and the ruling Habsburgs, which developed the ideology of Bolshevism. And we all know the story of the Ukrainians in World War II and the post-Soviet era, but the Ukrainians would be again shaped for another 100 years as the West and East merged together before the fall of 1920, and then they were absorbed by the Soviet Union, and the rest is history, as yet again Ukrainian lands would be fought over in the Polish War, World War II, and even the blockade of the Iron Curtain left the Soviet Union, the Poles, the Czechs, the Romanians under the same Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union. Like other colonial possessions and states under the Tsar and Russia, they would too become the Stalinist era of tragedy. Yeah, that's cheesy. I'm gonna end it here.